like to find your seats and we can begin. My name is Driver Goodwin, and I teach at the Slade School of Fine Arts here at UCL. I'm the head of print, and I'm currently acting as one of the deputy directors of the school. So before we start properly introducing this evening William Kentridge, I've just got to get a few safety practicalities out of the way. So if the alarm sounds, we're not expecting a drill, so please make your way out of the building at the nearest designated exit, and we will assemble outside Waite's House, Gordon Street. Also, importantly, please can you make sure that your mobile phones are switched off? That would be great. So, next I'd like to introduce Professor Ed Allington, who also teaches at Slade, and he's the chair of the William Townsend Committee, and he'd like to say a few words.
I will.
Can I have that, please?
Right, if it works. Yeah. Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to the William Townsend Memorial Lecture, which has been hosted at the Slade since 1974. The primary aim of the William Townsend Memorial Lecture Series is to encourage well-known and influential artists to talk about their work. To art students and to the wider public. In the past we have hosted eminent artists, historians, as well as distinguished artists including Norbert Linton, Richard Cork, David Bryson, artists such as Horace Hodgkin, Susan Hiller, Richard Hamilton, Rachel Whiteread and Philippa Barlow. William Townsend himself was a significant landscape painter, studying at the Slade in the 1920s. He continued to be an influential figure in the Slade's history. In 1958 he was supported as an individual professor with responsibility to develop a postgraduate fine art course, which still continues, and many of you are on those fine art courses, the MFA and the MA. Thanks to the generosity of William Townsend's family, the Slade is able to continue to represent the legacy of an artist and educator who made a major contribution to fine art in England and Canada to the William Townsend Memorial Lectures. I now shall pass to Slade, who's going to introduce our distinguished guest.
Thank you. It's an honour for us to welcome William Kentridge to the Slade. Drawing time, the figure mapped in space, in cultural context and against the constructs of theatre and the mechanisms of the universe. All these themes find significant resonance with the creative inquiry that has and continues to take place at the Slade by both students and staff alike through such practices as printmaking, theatre design, the life room, sculpture and the moving image. In William Kentridge's work, we experience artists whose prolific and extraordinary output holds the very essence of these themes and processes at its core, playing with the theatre of life, the politics and mechanics of society, and the beauty and fragility of both the natural and the constructed world. Through his exquisite draftsmanship and expressive mark-making, in his playful and profound experiments, exploring the relationship between the still and the moving image. His astonishing show Thick Time, currently running until mid-January at the Whitechapel Gallery, is a masterclass in immersive installation and an elegant blueprint for the artist as director and collaborator. His innovation is nourished and inspired by the artistry of his collaborators in music, dance and skilled crafts. He is able to construct worlds within worlds and constantly reinvent the gallery experience. I urge you to see the show if you haven't had the chance to do so yet. So thank you for being here with us this evening, William. We have eagerly looked forward to this close encounter with you and with your practice.
what is our center of gravity? So I walk across the room. But there's a particular walk and gait that each of us has. So there are some people who, when they walk, they are led by the chest. You see them walking as if their center point of movement, their principle of movement is the chest. Or from the shoulders. See people who walk with the shoulders, or gently pushed from behind. People who walk pushed from behind. Or led when the nose is the way that they walk, their principle of movement. Or the top of the head. You can see people who walk. And the top of the head is their principle of the center of their movement. So one thinks one can escape the way that we move, but in fact buried in us is a particular nature and style of walking. And it's something that's very clear. We recognize a particular person's gait from 400 meters in a huge crowd. It's something very tightly allied to a person. We don't know what it is, but we can recognize it very clearly when we see it. Now, this particular lecture was deconstructed and reconstructed many times. At one point it broke up into 3 separate lectures. There was one lecture about turning sound into ink, which was a lecture about the making of the opera Lulu. There was a second lecture about finding the less good idea. It included an account of the dream of a red bicycle. There was a third lecture about that which we do not remember, but that turned into a lecture about an ephemeral project in Rome that was done earlier this year and had a separate lecture I will not give today. So this lecture was dismembered and reconfigured in the form of lists and paragraphs moving from notebook to notebook. At one point I stopped making these notes and just spent 20 minutes in front of the mirror looking at the walking that was done and the possibilities of different kinds of walking. There was a section on a fight in a nursery school that all the different lectures claimed. Each lecture demanded the less good idea. There were certain sections and paragraphs about nightingales and sparrows that fell between the cracks. I was trying to find an order, a logical progression, a straightforward argument, wanting to make a logical argument about the illogicality of the processes of drawing and thinking. So it was a formal argument dependent on the informality of the working and the thinking behind it. So thinking of the lecture as a formal recycling depot, but which is nonetheless dependent on all the gleaners and rag pickers of ideas that come from the peripheries of the studio and the city, bringing the ideas to a central depot where they get sorted and put together. So to what extent is our way of walking under our control? Do we control the movement, or are the specifics of the movement in fact reveal who we are? We recognize the particularities of someone's walk. In the same way, to what extent is this lecture, which would be to say a drawing, and its different paragraphs under my control? And to what extent are they held by their own limitations, the way one thinks one can escape one's walk, but you end up walking the same way? Each time an argument or a drawing begins, it seems as if it will go into new territory. But somehow, as with the walking, it finds its way back into familiar patterns and paths, and reveals inevitably the limits and the blindnesses of the writer or the artists. So the paragraphs are recut, reordered, as in making a drawing, editing it, collaging it. And what remains after all this process is this final lecture. And I'm inclined to say this final lecture, naked and unprotected. Here in my notes it says, at this stage, at 9:15 p.m. on Sunday the 31st of July 2016, I am not optimistic that anything new will emerge. This was the second page of the words of the notebook. An earlier attempt to start writing, no thought, no idea or image, on June the 7th, 2016 at 3:30 p.m. turned into a print. So we could just sit in silence, waiting for the ideas to gel. While waiting for the lecture to find clarity, I started making a short film, a notebook of ideas for the lecture. It was a procrastination. It's easier to draw than to write. It always helps to think less hard. So the practicalities of drawing and of the studio push thinking into a secondary position. The work in the studio has to do with the exposure, the shape of the paper, the tension. You turn time into numbers, a 6-frame pause, a quarter of a second, or an 8-frame pause, a third of a second, 1,500 frames of a film to make 1 minute of screen time. And then a hunt for images. A boy running, an image of the drawing of text, and then the question, how do these relate? So there's an impulse for an image or a meaning, but then in the studio, how do these different things fit together? Is the page of text next to the boy running? Do they follow each other? What is the boy running away from? The thought emerges briefly and then it passes on. What are you running away from? Does this thought stay as a text? To run from. What does one run from? Running from or running to? And then there's a fragment of a 1960s song that goes through my head. Oh, Cinnamon, where are you going to run to? Is there something in these secondary thoughts that hover at the edges of the drawing itself that can lead us to a different understanding, to make a different meaning? Now, I feel if I'd simply made a film rather than the lecture, then I could really have made a good lecture. And what I'll show you now is a section of this incomplete film that I made. At the back of another notebook, I started a record of fugitive words, a list of words that I had used but couldn't, that which had escaped me. I noted the period for which they were absent. So something that was, it's not a panorama, it's not a vitrine, but something in a museum, and about 14 hours later, the diorama appears. Now thinking of a French playwright on the edge, not not Artaud, the other one, and then about 7.5 hours later, Genet appears. For breaking a wall, a stick with a heavy weight at the end. After 7.5 minutes, the sledgehammer appears. I knew the words, but they were absent for that time. So they were in me, but also outside of me. I wondered where they had got up to, what Jean Genet was doing in the museum with a sledgehammer in his hand. And while I searched for these phrases, I made a list, paintings of words and phrases. And I made these in lapis lazuli, in watercolor of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, as if somehow the paper and the pigment would help the words to make sense. There were different phrases like yesterday's good idea, struggle for a good heart, the secondary process, privatize the hereafter, that which we do not remember. So we caught halfway between reading and looking. The words on the one hand have a sense, and they're a shorthand for a larger set of ideas, a single phrase that could stand in for a paragraph. So history on one leg is a reference to the toi-toi, the dance in South African protests in the 1980s and 1990s. But when you see the phrase, the specific meaning separates. And we're left with the phrase that hovers at the edge of nonsense, but which we cannot resist trying to make sense of. And there are always different associations waiting in the wings to come and push the main idea off stage. In this case, one thinks of the old Jewish sage, Hillel the Elder, and the man's demand that he explains the moral law while his interlocutor stands on one leg. And he answers, that which is hateful unto you, do not do unto another. We have phrases that exist almost as riddles. Whose private thoughts? What are the private thoughts that go through? So what does this refer to in the world? But there's also the fact of the specific materials, the paint, the paper, the color, and the form. So there is a thinking in charcoal for one kind of drawing. There are transformations into copper, into air. There are transformations of word into ink, from thought into copper, and transformations, as it were, into the four elements, into charcoal, a kind of fire, into ink, a kind of water, into copper with engraving, into the earth, and of course with words like this, into air. And these simply allude to the fact that the different materials have within them different kinds of thinking. So one thinks of the softness of charcoal and how with a simple wipe of a chamois leather cloth you can make both the image and the thought disappear. You can change your ideas as quickly as you can wipe the cloth. And when you're working with something like ink, obviously it sinks into the paper, it's much tougher, you can attempt to rub it away, but it will resist. There's a resistance and a holding on to a thought. And in a way you need a much more brutal shifting of ideas to change the idea that is there in the paper. And the idea of cutting and pasting becomes the way one would work with ink. And of course, cutting and pasting is the natural way in which the lecture itself developed. When we work with copper, then there's an actual resistance. So every damage done to the plate with acids, with a sharp instrument, with an engraving tool, damages the plate, and the finished engraving is always a record of the damage done to the plate. And if you put a word into the copper plate, there's both the labor of putting it in, and then again the labor of altering it, of scraping, of burnishing, of re-etching, to change it, to take the S out of slaughter, to take the S out of smothering, to make a mothering. Yesterday's good idea will prevail, even if you change your mind. Whereas with speech, the alteration is effortless. I can say one thing, and I can claim its opposite. The word is there, and it's gone. I can distract you with rhetorical flourishes, with fabulous feasts of alliteration, so we don't notice as truth leaves the stage. In the end, I trust the etching far more than I trust the lecture. Words are free, but the drawing somehow has to earn its keep. In another notebook, I make two lists. I make a list of things which I have already drawn, and I make a list of things which I've never drawn. So the things I've drawn, including things like a cat, a kabelio, a wheelbarrow, Marcus Aurelius, Trotsky, the Drakensberg, the orbit of a planet, a Weimaraner, and then a list of things which I have never drawn: a Bontebok, Aristotle, Imelda Marcos, a Cour Anglais, the Blue Mosque, Charles Aznavour, a treadmill, Creme Anglaise. Again, going back to the list which I have drawn: a time bomb, Bok Choy, a love seat, the Union Buildings, the Empire State Building, a soda siphon, a swimming pool, a pelican, the Angel Gabriel, and things I have never drawn: Bilharzia, Roundtree's fruit pastilles, a shifting spanner, a stealth bomber, a portrait of the Queen, a bridge over the canal, the Prophet, a daguerreotype, and things I have drawn: a naked woman, a cave, a shadow, Haile Selassie, a foxtrot, a tango, Pope Clement IV. What is a list like this? A list is a displaced memory. The list remembers for us. It is from us, but it exists independently. It is a canned memory. It remembers on our behalf. I forget what is on the list, but the list remembers for me. The list is in the book. I move away. The list remains. It is part of that huge category we can describe as coming from us, but more than us. Made by me, but also independent. A displaced version of the self. In the form of art, obviously coming from that part of me which has a need for something from myself to be seen externally and viewed by people outside. A material demonstration in one form or another that I was here. And undoubtedly and inadvertently we lay bare, we lay ourselves bare, both in what we choose to draw and in what we choose not to draw, as well as how we drew it. So there is an inadvertent autobiography here. What are the images that, for a variety of reasons, have been called to be drawn, where the outside world and the artist meet on the page? Over the years, what is the total of these calls, of these siren calls, of these desires? So we can make a self-portrait of these objects. And what of those parts of the world that have not been drawn, that have not come into the studio? So there is also a self-portrait of exclusion. All the silences, all the images that pass through us like neutrinos, leaving no trace either on the paper or the cathode ray tube. These are the images, but there is another self-portrait in the drawing itself. How is the drawing made? Is it tentative? Is it assertive? Is it indecisive, innocuous, ambitious? Is it pretentious or portentous? What about its love of mark? A poet once wrote that love of words is love of self. One could say the same thing about the love of mark making or gesture in itself. So the work and the words become a self-portrait, showing not just the objects or the marks made, but the maker of them, who cannot escape. I make a self-portrait of myself as a rhinoceros, as a hotel, as a landscape, as a coffee pot. I start the drawing, and then I step back. And there is another self watching the drawing, trying to see the drawing afresh as it develops. This will be familiar to all of you who have ever made a drawing. The making of the drawing and the stepping back to look at it. And this other self uses all the tricks in the trade to try to see it afresh. He squints, he screws up his eyes, he looks through one eye, he spins round to see the drawing afresh, he looks at it in the mirror, he tilts my head to try to see it again, he looks through my fingers, in his phone he reduces it in scale and looks at how the drawing looks in the phone. Trying to always separate the drawing from the activity of the making of it. Now, there are many different dances that go on between the artist and the sheet of paper. There is the work at the paper, keeping no more than an arm's distance away from the paper. Charcoal, chamois leather, erasers, brushes, all held in the hand to keep the work with a sheet of paper 1 arm's length in front of you. And one can try to say, all right, I'm not going to step back and look at the drawing. The drawing will be done in this moment, and when I step back, the drawing is finished, and I will not let the artist as viewer have a look in and tell me what to be doing with it. But it's very hard to avoid this artist as viewer. I've never succeeded in it. I can try, but then as I'm about to leave the studio for lunch, you give a final look around and you can see that the tree trunk is too light, that there's a shadow needed, and then at the last minute you dash back across the studio and add that in, and then go back out to the door, but as you're leaving yet again there's another view, and again you rush back to keep doing it. And this continues. It continues, and in the end the soup gets cold. But this last minute drawing, this quick fresh look, this jump back to the drawing, is without doubt the most lively part of the conversation between the drawing and the artist. And this conversation is, of course, always a conversation with yourself. But the conversation with the drawing, this goes in several different directions. On the one hand, there's a reference to the world, to something in the outside world that calls to be drawn. So one has an equestrian statue. And it's a question of making an equestrian statue rather than writing an essay about empire. Because it's both about empire, but it's also about the nature of human aggrandizement, of what it is to sit astride a horse, the way a horse sits underneath your legs. And a conversation not only with that part of history, but with the other history, the history of making images, of the different ways in which drawings of people on horses have been done over the years. The artificiality of it. You know that when you sit for an equestrian portrait, you don't sit with a real horse under you. That's a complete fiction. You sit on top of some piece of gymnastic equipment, more or less the same height as a horse, which will keep still for the hours needed for the posing. Very often the person posing himself is absent, and there's simply the armature that is there. So there's both the history of the image making, there's the drawing of it, and the part of the outside world to which it refers. And the interest is in drawing, for example, a pigeon with a camera strapped to its belly as a way of thinking about the First World War and the connection to drone warfare, rather than writing the essay making these different connections. So it's both about history coming in, but also about the cultural history of our eyes. The world is invited into the studio, the horse, the bird, the equestrian statue, and there it is taken apart, deconstructed, reconstructed, shattered, cut up, and sent back out. And the conversation in the studio is also, of course, about the sensual material. It is about the drawing meeting the paper, the tooth of the paper. How much charcoal will it hold? A different kind of dictionary paper will hold different amounts of ink. Will the inks be absorbed? How much size is there in the paper? Is the tooth, and the tooth of papers made before 1750 in old dictionaries, is a fantastic surface to draw on with charcoal. What about the hardness and nature of the different kinds of charcoal? The hardness of compressed charcoal and the miracle softness and blackness of charcoal made from the aerial roots of the swamp cypress. Now, for several years I stopped drawing in charcoal at all, and I realized this was because a particular kind of charcoal I'd used was no longer available. There was charcoal made in Italy, which was as thick as one's wrist, and soft and black. And it's so thick that only really the front of the charcoal and the memory muscles of your wrist knew where it was going to hit the sheet of paper. And this was made as a byproduct of making cadmium yellow in Italy. And at a certain point, the European Union decided that this cadmium yellow was carcinogenic, so they stopped its production, and this stopped the charcoal production. And then for years, I went around every art supply shop I could find as I traveled around the world trying to find the same charcoal, which did not exist anymore. And about 6 months ago, I was given a box of charcoal made from the aerial roots of the swamp cypress from the northern part of South Africa. And it was the reawakening of an astonishing pleasure, the actual physical material and softness and sensuality of that charcoal on paper. So it must be said again, the physical material of charcoal, of paper and ink, is at the heart of drawing. And insofar as disegno, drawing, is broader than simply making drawings, but it's also about thinking. Drawing is about thinking in a material, finding meaning in the different materials. And where does this drawing begin? So firstly, there's an actual circling in the studio, gathering the impetus for the first marks to be made. A literal circling around in the studio, gathering an energy. This is part of the prehistory of the performance of making the drawing. It leaves no visible trace on the paper, but it is still an essential part of the performance. A performance backstage, warming up for the drawing. It's a kind of procrastination. And this procrastination, I realize now, is an essential part of the performance that cannot be avoided. And these performances obviously vary from artist to artist, but there's the extra cup of tea before you start drawing, and one more look at the email, and filling the dog's water bowl, and hunting for the right CD to listen to while drawing, and then changing your mind and hunting for another CD. And then, of course, one more last check of the email to see what's there, until the options are exhausted and the drawing begins. But the drawing itself gathers itself in the body, in the taste buds at the back of the throat, in the pectoral muscles under your arm. And there is a rehearsal of the gesture, and then the performance of the drawing itself. What is the degree of tension in the body? Is the mark a very loose, relaxed mark across the paper? Is it a neutral mark, like drawing a line along a ruler from one point to another? Is it slightly more tense? Is there an impulse at the beginning of the mark that needs to be made? Is it a passionate mark that stripes its way? Is it so tense that you're scrubbing your way through the sheet of paper with the charcoal or the eraser? All of these are part of the dance and performance of the making of the drawing. Does the mark come from the center, from the pelvis, as you're making the mark? Is your whole body involved? Is it just from the shoulder? Is it just from the elbow, from the wrist, or just from the knuckle? One has to remember that drawing is always a physical activity, what my daughter would describe as semi-skilled manual labor, when she was asked to describe what her father did. It is always the body in relation to the paper. And all of this choreography, the action before the drawing itself, the material of the paper, the ink, the complementary movement, turning away from the drawing, coming back to look at it in all the different ways. All of this choreography to arrive at simply a drawing of a coffee pot or a pine cone. The drawing may be striking or it may be stupid, but it is the place where not knowing, illogicality, impulse, and association are given a space to flourish. A space for the play or the tumbling of ideas that is both physical and metaphoric. A place for a free flow of idea, action, and material. So we go from the prehistory of the making of the prehistory of the drawing to the making of the drawing, both of which are essentially private performances in the studio. We go from there to the performance of the drawing outside the studio. Once they leave the studio, the drawing and the artist, what then? How to behave, how to perform their role. So the drawing generally performs as a mute, unmoving subject balanced on a gallery or house wall. It's usually dressed up for the occasion with glass, sometimes with a starched white passe-partout, with a frame around it, very often hoping for the beauty spot of a red dot to be applied to it. And the artist is here performing the lecture, the explanation. And the lecture theatre becomes another kind of studio. And the activity of making the drawing replaced with this. Now the words describing the drawing and the making of it, obviously much more logical than the process itself, and are kinder in a way closer to the finished drawing in which a clarity is reached. Well-structured paragraphs corresponding to elements of the completed drawing. But to try to give an idea of the performance of the drawing, of the incoherence, of the illogicality of making it, we need in a way to also break the paragraphs down, to open up the syntax. So instead of a complete sentence or a complete paragraph, we substitute a phrase, a pressing need, burnt wood, more fuel in winter, a song for those who should know better, anti-Z, hope against hope. These kind of odd phrases to show that unclarity is part of the making. To show the opening up of a space for association and inviting the viewer to complete the sense of the phrases. Now we can break it down even further from these phrases which represent a paragraph to sounds, to grunts, to syllables, such as we find in the Ur-Sonata of Kurt Schwitters, which is about also a language that doesn't make sense, a pre-language through which one tries to make sense of the world also. Now I place this performance between us, coming from me, but wishing you to join in its construction. Now, this is easy if the words are, and the subject are familiar. So the artist will talk about the process and show his work, that's clear. But it is more a leap on your part if its sentences are less direct, if there are broken phrases, sequi non tuos, inversions, the re-vis, syllables, disgra, ling little ox se, te o coming, too easy, bay, words slurred, to etch, it, print in, comes as it comes closer back to sense, we follow it again with a greater ease. At a certain point we can't make the leap to the phrases and sounds that are made, but this also makes us more aware of the other moments when we are able to leap and put the different pieces together. So in the drawing of the pigeon and the marks and the sound of those marks. So, tree, dapple, void, camera, traum, shadow, hope, 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 devet, emit, snurs, funsbo, funsbovota, funsbovota ca, funsbovota ca u, pogif, funsbovota ca u, pogif kri e. Luka trgil, luka trgil, rakete a, rakete a, rakete b, rakete blitzekete, rakete blitzekete. Luka trgil, yo, yo, mu, mo, move, uit kwe til pur, foul, green, baum, vogel, nail, panic, make, close, the gap, to leap. Have you heard the rumors? Have you heard the rumors? Have you heard the rumors? No, but I believe them. The drawing is a complete performance of the record of its making. The drawing on the walls of the gallery or house of the museum has a mute, unvarying performance. The artist, as shown here, has a new performance. But I want to talk now about the drawing itself off the wall, joining the performance, joining the speech, the music, the movement on this or other stages, where the process direct or inchoate of making the drawing continues, where the drawing becomes an extension of the body, where the 1 meter 60 by 1 meter 20 of the drawing is in a way an echo and enlargement of the 11 centimeters between different sections of our brain where thoughts are shifting across, mimicking the unseen movements of thoughts inside our brain, going from the newly forgotten to the almost remembered, but also where the physical drawing, the ink and the paper, meet the movement of the body. Now, the movement of the body also has to do with a reverse. One can almost imagine the drawing and then go reverse from the drawing into capturing what was the movement inherent in it. Thinking of the artist as a kind of pencil in which the movements in the studio are captured as a final record of a drawing, but also exist as a record just of movements in themselves. So the drawing itself could almost be reversed back into the movements in it. The drawing becomes simply a record, a way of storing those movements which have been performed. Now there's a paradox of the mask. I hold up a drawing, and the drawing has a movement much the way one might hold a drawing in an auction house for auction, to be shown. Okay, we start again. I hold up a drawing, much like the white-gloved attendants might hold it up at an auction house displaying it. And here the movement is in the person moving it. The drawing is simply passive. The drawing is completely passive in its movement. But there can also be a movement, a moment, when the movement is transferred to the drawing itself, where there's a demand and a limitation of what the movements can be set by the drawing itself. Is it sinuous? Is it rolling? Does it have to have pauses? It's not necessarily something that we know, but something we can recognize when we see it. A meeting of images and associations and illusions that arise within us and meet it. And we see this in all the work with masks, with puppets, with shadows or silhouettes, with drawings literally in movement with us. We make the movement and then recognize in it something more than ourselves. We surrender to the limitations of what the drawing itself demands. We make the movement, but then recognize something greater than simply the manipulation in it. And in the minutiae of the movement, we shift our focus to the object or drawing in movement, rather than we shift our focus to what that movement reveals, rather than just looking at a drawing that's being moved in space. And in the studio, there's a moment of recognition of this shift. And then the work in the studio is trying to track that down, to learn the grammar of the drawing itself, of the silhouette, of the mask, of the puppet, of the object. To see what are its limitations, what is its desire for movement. What is the natural way for that object to move through the world in the same way that we saw the different kinds of walks at the beginning of the talk this evening. So these are a section of studio experiments and rehearsals, testing out again the movement, and some of these are successful. The figure in the center you can see is moving too much to be clearly read, and you feel it as an object that is simply being moved by the person carrying it. And this is a kind of a practical epistemology of endlessly playing and replaying with these objects and movements, finding their grammar and syntax. That you're seeing here is an extension of that work with shadows and silhouettes done in a project in Rome that I was, one of the possible lectures that I referred to, in which there's both drawings on the wall, but here I want to look mainly at the shadows being carried, which also have the possibility of huge enlargement with the angle of the light, and the person carrying the flag to the scale of the shadows. Silhouettes and shadows. Now a mask is another extension of an actual drawing which has its movement in the real world, and this is paradoxical. One expects when you wear a mask for the focus to be on the mask itself, to draw attention to it and make the person carrying the mask secondary to it. But in a way the opposite happens. If you put on a mask and what suddenly comes into focus is not so much the mask itself but everything that is around it. If you take the mask off and put it on the stand, then it becomes an object, a piece of sculpture, and it's looked at as a sculptural object. But once worn, the movement in it and the movement it demands transforms how one reads it and its focus. In a way, it deflects our attention, shifting it to everything that is not the mask, the better to observe the movement. So the gesture or action which the moment before had been invisible in its banality suddenly comes into focus. I pick up a glass of water, but when there is a mask, even if it's a tiny mask of a clown's nose, suddenly the hand picking up the water gets a different focus. The mask becomes, in a way, a trainer of the body, imposing its speed, its need for stillness, a demand for a recul, for a return, before a forward moment is done. So again, what I'm going to show you are some experiments and rehearsals done in the studio of working with masks, these for the production of Lulu, which we were working on the time. A few of these fragments made their way into the production, many didn't. But again, it was a way of trying in the studio to understand what the demand of the movement of this drawn object was. Trying to see how much stillness it needed. If the head was moving the whole time or the drawing was moving the whole time, could you still see it? Did it still hold it? Here's a place where you can see the movement of the hands is too continuous to be read, but the stillness of the marks here makes everything else very visible. And the moment of stillness of the mark, the man with the spade, is also an essential moment in it. In the end, none of these moments were used in the opera. Now these are all really questions of the rehearsal room and the studio. In fact, it's the central work of the studio, understanding the obligation to the demands of the medium, whether it's charcoal or ink or cardboard, or in fact, as I write this morning, the ink in the barrel of the pen. What is it that it makes possible, and what is it that it demands? Learning from the different kinds of walks and seeing what are the images that they provoke, what are the sets of associations that they provoke. What happens when you actually start moving sheets of paper themselves against each other, somewhere between a puppet and a drawing? Again, these are all rehearsal fragments from the studio for the production of Lulu. So the world is invited into the studio and then transformed into different materials in the studio, and then one learns about the world through learning about the demands of the particular materials. So in this case, for example, with Lulu, one of the questions is, what is the nature of the desire of all the different men in the opera, different husbands and lovers who desire Lulu, and her response to them? And one of the images, or one of the sets of associations that came from this way of working with different sheets of paper halfway between a puppet and a drawing, had to do with the instability of the object of desire. That the image of Lulu is never one stable thing, it keeps shifting. Lulu is never quite the woman that the men want her to be. The men are never quite the men that Lulu wants them to be. They never can quite meet. In operatic terms, of course, this means at the end of every scene, someone is dead on the stage. But that death is about that impossibility of a stability of desire. And this was a series of experiments to find different kinds of language objects could change, how the drawings could change. These were large-scale projections on the backdrop and on the scenery of the opera stage. So these fragments are brought here to the lecture to try to track the relation to the studio, to drawing and performance, the shift from drawing into words, the movement here and the porousness of the studio walls. So this was trying to find a single drawing of Lulu, but discovered in fact the most interesting or accurate drawing of Lulu had to do with very shifting and changing and instability. And the final thing of videos that I'm going to show you is the silent movie or the movie that is in the middle of Lulu, which has to show her arrest, her trial, her sentencing to prison, her contracting of cholera in prison, her changing of her clothes with her woman lover, and her escape from prison. Now, I realize we've not strayed anywhere really beyond the studio and this lecture hall. And there were so many things at the beginning of writing the lecture that I'd wanted to talk about. The pine cone and the hammer, the sparrows and the nightingales, a boy running, history on one leg, pushing and bending down. Now, the pine cone and the hammer. This was going to be a lecture about Trotsky in the 1920s, who wrote about the human being as a semi-manufactured product. And he said if only we could perfect that part of the human being known as psychology, we would have a human adequate for the new world that was going to be made. And I was 4 years old in a nursery school in Johannesburg, and there was a ruckus in the playground. There were 2 5-year-old boys fighting. One was armed with a pine cone, and one was armed with a hammer. Now, a hammer I could understand, but a pine cone, the thought of hitting a face, a nose, a cheek with all those spikes on a pine cone, that seemed impossible. In my memory, there was a kind of a panicked rush by teachers, but I thought, what is the hope for this reconstruction of the psychology of the human being in the face of this pine cone and hammer? The Eurasian tree sparrow. This was going to be a lecture about the Great Leap Forward in China. Chairman Mao Zedong's program for modernization in China in the 1950s, where they declared war on rats, on the 4 bads on rats, mosquitoes, cockroaches, and sparrows. The sparrows were eating the crops, so they killed millions of sparrows, but sparrows were also eating baby locusts. So there was a plague of locusts and the huge famine, and it was a lecture about the folly of assuming one could control and transform nature. This is a very abridged version of the lecture. But the drawing of the birds, of the sparrows, was both about the paper and the ink and how that worked, and the history outside of the studio. I've spoken about walking, and this would have been a lecture about running. Now, with a child running, we assume they are in their element, but an adult running is always about panic. I mean, yes, okay, there's gym, there's the Olympics, there's all of that kind of running, but outside the sports arena, when an adult runs, it's usually a panic. To escape a bomb blast, to rescue a child, there's an emergency going on. And this lecture would have been about the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 and photographs of people running from that event. There would have been a lecture about a biography of gestures, of running, of history on one leg, of the toys of the 1980s and 90s, which is a physical gesture which embodies this will to transform South Africa. And then bending at the waist, a lecture about gleaning, the current state of rag pickers and recycling people gathering all the debris of the world onto their trolleys and pushing them through the streets of Johannesburg to the central recycling depot. A lecture about the formal and informal economy. These were the lectures that I meant to give. In the outside world, connecting the world to them, human gestures of hopping, bending down, speaking. I thought if only I could sing, then I really could have made a good lecture. There would have been a lecture about drawing and music, about how different kinds of ink make you hear differently, a subsection on dancing for those who should know better, about rhythm, about the importance of losing rhythm, about how easy that is for some of us to be out of time, allied to a lecture on the pleasures of collaboration in the studio. So these lectures are not just about themselves and their movement, but the movement and the attempt to tie the world to us and to me and the studio. The running, the hopping on one leg, the bending down, are also about tying the world to us, both inside and outside the studio, even though we know that the pine cone and hammer will not be abandoned. Why continue with these gestures, with these drawings, these words, in the face of their imminent failure? Because without some idea of utopia, of a rescued world implicit not just in these gestures, but in the act of making a drawing, of making a performance, of making a speech, without this, we feel a gap, a hollow. There's something missing. The drawing can become a solace. The drawing makes us more than just who we are, ourselves, but something beyond who we are. However stupid, repetitive, unclear the drawing is, the drawing in its making both demonstrates this need, we have to be more than we are, and shows its possibility. Thank you.
William, thank you for that wonderful, evocative exploration of process and thinking through process. We have a short while for some questions, and about 10-15 minutes. And I wondered if I could just kick things off. At the centre of what you've been talking about is this such a strong and vivid relationship between performance and drawing, and I wondered whether you could maybe tell us a little bit about how the realisation of the potential of this relationship, how it evolved, whether it was a sort of decisive moment or whether it happened over time.
At school, at university, and from there on, I was involved in both amateur theatricals and in drawing. And there were two separate activities. And I was given very strong advice to do one or the other, but not to try to do both. One would end up, of necessity, a dilettante and starving between two restaurants, all the different metaphors. And it took me a good 15 years to unlearn that advice and to discover that the only hope for the drawing was when the drawing was impure, when it also responded to needs outside the activity of drawing, and the theatre also was shifted and informed by the activity of drawing at its edges. And this came through first changing the drawings into animated drawings, and then working with the animations with the Handspring Puppet Company, doing various performances in which there was a mixture of drawing, animation, and puppetry. So it felt there was never a decision. Now I go back to theatre. I discovered, however much I tried not to be back in theatre, that's where I was, as well as in the studio. I tried for several years not to be in the studio, but I failed and was reduced to being an artist.
So maybe we could take some a question from the floor.
Maybe make the lights brighter.
Yes, let's make the lights brighter. No place to hide.
Cool. The questions are not essential.
Susan, let me get the...
Well, just really to follow on from what Dryden said, I mean, what really strikes me is that the intimacy of drawing, you already write you and the page, and the camera's on you. And then what we haven't mentioned is the fact that you're about to have this major opera at the ENO. And of course, the show at the Whitechapel is so complex and so kind of almost overwhelming in terms of the kind of layers and the many things you bring in, which must have huge production with lots of people involved. And I just wonder if you could just say a little bit, you've been so open about your process in terms of the drawing, but how does that work? How do you take it from there with this?
I think one can think of a kind of a sine curve of the pleasures of working alone in one's studio, and at a certain point it's a huge pleasure to work with many other people. And I show you after enough weeks with lots of people in the studio, the pleasure of having the space to oneself. So there is a kind of a flow. It's not as if there's always many people in the studio. And when there are, then I really need the quiet time at night and to do the drawing. It doesn't help anyone else to be in the studio when drawing happens. But with many other activities, so if the tapestries start in the studio, it's a small drawing or a collage, but then there's a team of weavers, not in my studio, in their own studio, busy making it. There are months of drawing in preparation for the opera, and then certain workshop periods where there'll be the costume designer, the lighting designer, set designer, editor, all of us together for 10 days in my studio and many other actors. And that's a very intense period where the whole project takes another leap, and then they would all disperse to their different spaces and fields, and then there'd be many months of just doing the animation, doing the drawing. But it's not simply working with skilled technicians that realize my instructions. It's very much the work also being shaped by the things that they can do, by their capacities, by the possibilities they open up. Much of the paper or the different kinds of techniques in the studio have their own push towards certain themes being carried. But the pleasures of collaboration are enormous.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Liz?
Thanks. Hi, thank you, that was fantastic. There were two things I wanted to just ask you about. One is the way that you are piecing together smaller bits of paper to make a larger bit, which is obviously important, essential, but actually completely unnecessary because you could get larger pieces of paper ready-made. The other is the flatness of paper and how that informs what you do, which is obviously important, but when you have the performers performing, they are obviously three-dimensional, but then reduced to the flatness. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, one could certainly get a large sheet of paper and do it once. But the point of working on these separate sheets, particularly as I showed in the Lulu, is the possibility of the imperfect alignments, the overlaps. So you draw someone standing like this. Okay, if that's your drawing, then they're stuck there. If, just for example, you've drawn them in two separate sections, there's a whole series of possibilities of how those two sheets of paper can shift. You push the hip out, does the body lean, you cut the head off, the head can have a whole different attitude, and suddenly you find a different kind of movement. With the large drawings, it's also a kind of editing. With charcoal, you can edit by a quick erasure. The substituting of another sheet of paper becomes a different kind of erasure, of tearing and addition. So the multiple sheets of paper, yes, they're both unnecessary and essential, as one could say of art in general.
Yes, we have a
I have a loud voice, so let's get the mic.
even louder than
Thank you. William, there was something surprising to me. So much of your work, in fact your lecture, was very much a demonstration of the notions of erasure, ephemerality, of disjuncture, disconnection, breaking down, deconstructing, fragmenting, all of those images that you demonstrate so powerfully. And then right at the end, there was this notion of the idea of utopia, which for me was both surprising and joyful, and kind of hung it together for me. And I'd like you to just say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I mean that's a whole separate lecture. But I would say there's something in the agency of making, of what it is that anyone does when they write something, when they make a piece of music, when they do it, of what it is that comes from inside of you, outside, that needs someone outside to connect to. There's a utopian moment in that activity. And it's not to say that that's the same as transforming society, but within the studio on its own scale, it's a demonstration of one way of what a rescue could feel like, I think. That we're not simply passive receivers of the world. In every moment we are actively constructing meaning in it, both constructing who we are and our understanding of the world, as those different fragments of paper kind of sometimes show.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, if there is. Just here. Check that.
I noticed at the beginning of the lecture you talk about movement and unconscious movement and how we lead with our bodies, and obviously there's a connection between that and material because each material has its own expressive range. And I really love your work, and I noticed that you rely on charcoal, ink, and shadow quite heavily, and it has its own expressive range and its own limitations and its own kind of emotive abilities, and I'm curious what's behind that for you.
About the colour.
Yeah.
When I was at art school, the normal in South Africa in the 1970s, to be an artist was to paint with oil paint on canvas. That's what real artists did, and that's still, by and large, the default position of artists. Many artists around the world is that oil paint on canvas. But and some people, it's a lifelong activity to master that history and tradition and technique of what it is to work with. But it's a tiny part of art history, that particular tradition of illusion and all the possibilities that oil paint gave from when it was developed. And I was never at ease with it, not out of principle, not out of any polemic, but just I was cack-handed at it. I was really bad at it. And more than that, I was always reduced to the position of looking at my drawing and saying, does it look nice? Does it look sort of okay? Can I get away with it? Are the colors sort of all right? Rather than saying, this is a medium in which one can think, in which the world can be taken on. And I think that was the reason. So it was a huge relief when I first started making an etching in which the natural nature is to make it black and white. I was helped a huge amount by the tradition in South Africa of printmaking, and also just at the time when I was an adolescent of seeing work by South African artists, black South African artists who work with charcoal, large figurative drawing, particularly an artist, Dumili Feni, who did large figurative charcoal drawings. We suddenly thought, oh, it's actually allowed. One can work as a person making the drawings. But I have been, some friends of mine every now and then try to teach me how to paint in oils. And I could really enjoy being a Sunday painter. But it feels like that. It would be a hobby. It's not where the emphasis is. It's a limitation. It's not a virtue, but it's there. Good.
Thank you.
Good.